Meredith Burgmann, welcome into the weeds. An honour and privilege to have you here, a legend of New South Wales and Australian politics. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Jeremy.
I really appreciate it. My first question is, how does the daughter, I think of an Anglican archbishop, end up
Granddaughter
of an Anglican archbishop, but you were head girl at Abbotsleigh, weren't you?
Well, you have done your work, haven't you?
How do you end up being one of the most prolific, vocal and effective political radicals in Australia? How did you go from that to your activism?
I always say it was the Vietnam War that did it. I think if I hadn't been at university in 1968, which really was, well, it was the height of my life. It's all been downhill after that. But I certainly was brought up, I was born and bred in Beecroft. You cannot imagine at the time a more homogeneous suburb. I had never even spoken to a Catholic until I got to university. It was that white bread. And I did go to
the leafy suburbs of the North Shore.
Well, it's not really the North Shore, it's the main line. It might have been a bit more exciting if it had been the North Shore. There might have been a few scandals, but in Beecroft we didn't even have that. You know, it was very, very Protestant, very religious, lots of churches, no pubs, no shops. You know, it was very, they had a covenant not to have shops, in my part of it anyway. And it... yes, I went to Abbotsleigh only for 4 years because I arrived in second year, and it might have had a bad effect on me, except that we had the wonderful Betty Archdale as headmistress. And although we didn't know it at the time because it was hidden from us, Betty's mother had been one of the important suffragettes, and Betty even remembers visiting her in Holway Prison, because her mother, Helen Archdale, was locked up with her best friend at the time, Christabel and Adele. I can't remember the name of the famous old suffragette. It'll come back to me. Anyway, yeah, no, so Helen Archdale was a very famous suffragette, but that was totally hidden. In fact, I'm perfectly certain that the board members of Abbotsleigh didn't know that either. They would never have put her on as headmistress. What they knew about her was that she had been captain of the English women's cricket team. But that was okay. That was sort of hooray hockey stuff, so it was all acceptable. And Betty was a hugely important influence in, I think, all our lives. We've just had a 60th anniversary meeting and, you know, luncheon, and all the women talked about how important Betty had been in their lives. And I also have just come across a letter that she wrote to me when I got a jail sentence for running onto the cricket ground during the all-white Springbok tour. And she wrote me a letter offering to come and be a character witness for me. Like, she was still doing that. And I also had another letter from her where she asked me to come and speak about Vietnam at Abbotsleigh. So she was definitely a lefty, but I'm sure the people who made her headmistress of this posh girls' school on the North Shore, they would have had no idea.
So an early experience with subversion and revolution and feminism, like heady times. Like, we're talking the early 60s, cultural and sexual revolution.
Well,
amazing.
In the early 60s, none of that.
None of that at
No.
Abbotsleigh.
I mean, I think, and by the way, it's Emmeline Pankhurst, of course, who is who was the friend of Archie's mother.
I think she's a distant relative of mine.
Oh, that's very exciting.
Yeah.
You should track that one down.
I think I will.
Yeah. Although she obviously had an effect on us, I wasn't aware of it really, and I certainly would have imagined my mum was very conservative. She was a country party girl from the country. Mind you, she turned into a very fervent Whitlamite and and it was Vietnam that changed her too. But my father was a secret Labor voter because he was the chairman of CSIRO, and which was at the time very political because the Americans wouldn't give Britain atomic secrets because they thought that they would share them with CSIRO in Australia, and they thought of CSIRO as a nest of traitors was one of the expressions they used.
Really?
So what's happening in America now about CSIRO is rather interesting to me. But anyway, so I really had gone to university still thinking that Sir Robert Menzies was a great man because that's what you thought when you came from Beecroft. And it was Vietnam, and the everyday seeing what was happening on the television when you came home. And it was the first war where you actually saw bodies. It was quite shocking, and I'm absolutely sure that the shockingness of what we saw every night was what fueled the anti-Vietnam sentiment amongst the young people.
Because that is a really important point, because Vietnam was the first time that television cameras had been essentially in real time on the front line. So in battles like Hue and the Tet Offensive and these things, these pivotal moments in these wars, the politicians couldn't lie behind time and newsprint.
They
tried.
tried.
They tried.
Yeah.
But a picture tells 1,000 words.
One of the pictures that I think I and almost anyone who ever saw it stays in your brain is when the police chief of Saigon walks up to this supposedly Viet Cong prisoner who's just kneeling bound on the street, and he just goes up and shoots him in the head. And in front of all the cameras, every single...
Just executes him, stone cold.
Just execute him in front of all the media, couldn't care less, and then just puts his gun in his pocket and walks away. And I think that sort of thing was so shocking to us that even if I hadn't fallen in with a bad crowd at university, I immediately ended up. Strangely, it was a bunch of Catholics, radical Catholics, that I fell in with, who were all very anti-Vietnam. They were a bit older than me. One was my history tutor at the time, and I became anti-Vietnam pretty quickly. And our boyfriends and our male friends were being hauled off to either to prison or to conscientious objection court, or some of them even went into conscription was extraordinary.
The draft.
Yeah, I would have been totally opposed to it anyway. Conscription was just an add-on to me, and the fact that it took over the lives of the young men at the time was just extraordinary. I was very good friends with a guy called Jeremy Gilling, and I had to sit through all his conscientious objection cases because they kept having them. And you could have, unless you objected to all war, and they always asked the question, if someone was about to rape your mother, would you intervene? And you had to say no to that in order to be a proper conscientious objector. And if you were trying to argue that this war was unjust, which is what all my friends were doing, you couldn't be a conscientious objector. And so they either went into hiding or they went to jail. Jeff Mullen and a few others went into jail, and it was, a very frightening time, I think, for young men.
Yes, I know. Like, my dad was in the draft, terrified of it. Went out and hid out in Tasmania, in actual fact, and my godfather went out and hid in Sweden, and then went to a kibbutz in Israel. And so it totally upended their lives. And of course, the young men that went to the war, young men and women that went to the war, it came back and had a devastating impact upon them. And so, a hugely unjust war, and but a really formative experience for you as a young woman, university.
Yes, and I at the time there were very few women who took part in demonstrations. I mean, it's weird to think about it now because they're often the people leading the demonstrations now. But at the time, it was considered really unladylike to be involved. And in my second year at uni, I was in women's college because my parents thought that it might mean I did a bit more work, whereas I just thought, it gave me more time to demonstrate. But I'd go down to the demonstrations with my best friend from women's college, Nadia Wheatley, and the two of us were sort of, the rest of the colleges, especially the boys' colleges, just thought we were the pits because, nice girls didn't go on demonstrations, and they all supported Vietnam anyway. It was, there's this view of university at the time that everyone opposed Vietnam, but it was very, very much, we were still the minority till almost 1970, but certainly in the 60s, everyone opposed us. But Nadia and I would go down to the demonstrations, and here we were, breaking the law and getting arrested and everything, but we still obeyed the women's college rule that you had to wear a dress at all times. You weren't allowed to wear trousers outside of college. And for some reason, we just always stuck with that. So here we were getting arrested in our sort of miniskirts, trying to look very dignified while we were being dragged away.
Because I think you've been the most arrested MP in Australian history. I think you're up there with Bob Brown. I think you've been arrested, if I recall, 21 times.
Yes, we sat down once to try to work it out, and I think it was either 17 or 21. I can't remember, but and it's actually quite interesting because a lot of Bob's arrests have happened since he's been in Parliament, but there was a group that tried to stop me being in Parliament because of the arrests, because there's a very unclear clause that talks about something offence, heinous offence or something, but it's never been tested, it's never been defined. And when I became the left candidate to go into the upper house, the right definitely tried. They made sounds about me not, but
excluding you.
They were saying things like, "No, we can't have her because what happens if we have her and then it turns out that she's, ejected and then they put a lib in," sort of thing. It was that sort of argument, but they were definitely trying to make my candidature very fragile. But I had the wonderful Anthony Albanese arguing in my corner, and he's very good at that stuff.
He's gone on to bigger and better things, hasn't he?
He did, yes, so I understand. But he was the person who actually talked me into being in the upper house.
Well, let's get to that. But
yeah.
I'm particularly, because I've seen the footage, because I know someone else that was out there on the SCG with you. So one of your protests, one of your arrests is very famous. And look, at this point, we're going to bring up the footage of the apartheid. So we'll cut this in. And what we've just seen is the visiting Springboks from South Africa, the rugby union football team. They come to Australia, a very conservative crowd, a very white establishment crowd, the visiting Springboks, visiting from apartheid South Africa, where the majority black community were living under just abysmal oppression from the minority Boer white government. And you took it upon yourself to intervene.
Oh,
and
it had all, I have to take you a couple of years back before that. In 1969, one of my friends, he was an organiser for the Communist Party and a very important person, really. He was a great organiser. A bloke called Dennis Freeney called a meeting of people who were interested in anti-apartheid activity. And I'd always been, ever since I'd read Cry the Beloved Country as a school kid, I'd been really interested in it. So I went along and came out of the meeting as one of the co-conveners of the Stop the Tours campaign. So that was in 1969, and the other convener was Dennis, me, and an anarchist called Peter McGregor, and we all got on very well. That was that was why it was so successful, really. It just worked very well. And we decided to build up to stopping the, all white racially selected rugby union team from South Africa. And so we built up. We demonstrated against the basketballers and then the tennis players, and then had quite big demonstrations against the surf lifesavers. And if you think it's hard enough demonstrating against footy players, try demonstrating against people who save lives. It was very, very, and it was down at, it was at Cronulla. No, it was originally put down to be, the march past was meant to be at Cronulla, but the wonderful Arthur Geitselt, who was the in charge of, he was the head of the council there, he was the Shire president or whatever they call him, he refused to let them have Cronulla Beach, and that was the first time in the world that any government organisation had said no to the South Africans. So it was very significant. So it ended up happening at Coogee, and we had 600 people there, and the blokes were all pushing at the barbed wire fences and everything, trying to get down onto the sand. And a group of four women, we paddled out into the surf, then paddled back in again from the surf and threw ourselves under the march past. And we have wonderful photographs of, I grabbed the reel and hang on, and Franny Letters lies down in front of the guys, and they just marched over her.
Just stomped on them.
Just stomped over it, marched right over her. And but that was a very successful demonstration because it got very, very good newspaper coverage. There were great photos. And so by the time the Springboks arrived, which had all been aimed at stopping the Springboks, I remember saying to one of the ASIO guys, who it was actually New South Wales Special Branch guys, we knew who they all were, and we were out at the airport, I think, waiting for them. And
the New South Wales Special Branch was like a division of the New South Wales Police.
It was sort of like the state branch.
The state branch,
it's a bit, I think, what the anti-terror squad and that would be now. But the Special Branch were particularly awful. I have my Special Branch file, which was much more interesting than my ASIO file. Anyway, I remember saying I think we were out at the airport waiting for the basketballers or something, and I remember saying, just you wait, when the Springboks come, there'll be 1,000 of us out at the game. And of course there were 20,000 at that first game. The demonstration was huge. And
really, I didn't know it was that big. 20,000 protesters in a crowd that must have only been about 20 or 30,000.
Well, there were a lot of ruggerbuggers. But by the second game in Sydney, all police leave was cancelled, and they had 600 coppers in the. It was there's some very impressive photographs of it all. But we realised once again that you wouldn't be able to get onto the pitch from the hillside. And I knew the SCG very well because I was a cricket fan. And they had big barbed wire fences going up really high, about 20 feet, and from all the non-members areas. So I realised we have to get on from the members' side. And we borrowed members' tickets and went into the members, and we thought we were dressed up as middle-aged Afrikaners, which is why the photographs that everyone has seen of me is I've got this bad red wig on and a terrible sort of knitted cardigan to sort of make myself look like a... And we must have been very believable, because at one stage we asked the police that were standing in front of us, because the police were all around the ground, we asked them to move away so that we could see better. And they moved away. So we then leapt on top of our, we had a metal esky, which really helped, leapt on that and then jumped over the fence and onto the ground. And when we got into the middle, none of us, there were four of us, my sister Verity and two friends, and we didn't know what to do when we got there because no one had got onto the ground. And no one had got onto the ground before, but so I just lay down, but Verity got hold of the ball and kicked it, and the bulletin called it the best kick of the season. It just went up in the air, you know. And since then, I've actually talked to one of the...
Your sister Verity went on to... She's a professor of politics down at Monash.
At Melbourne.
Yeah.
And Monash, yeah. No, yeah, I've actually talked to one of the guys that... Because it wasn't a test, the first game. It was against New South Wales, I think. And one of the guys playing for New South Wales, I eventually had lunch with. It was a very, very difficult lunch. But anyway, and he told me how he should have hit me then, or, you know, they were very angry, even the Australian side. But the important thing about the anti-Springbok campaign was that 7 Australian rugby union internationals, you know, the Wallabies, seven Wallabies announced that they would refuse to play and campaigned against the tour. They were terrific guys. Well,
that was a seminal moment in the campaign, the very long campaign that then followed to dismantle apartheid. It made headlines around the world, and it was a key moment in that boycott the movement, wasn't it?
It was the first time that was really publicised, the fact that 7 players were refusing to play, and they're the ones that are still alive. I'm still very fond of and have lunch. In fact, I'm going to one of them's 80th birthday on Sunday. But we thought they were the first that had ever refused to play. But looking back, there was an English cricketer called David Shepherd, who later became the captain of the English cricket team, and then later the Bishop of Woolwich. But he refused to play them in 1961, and there was a Welsh rugby union player that refused to play them in 63. So there had been 2 people before.
Look, like the courage it must have taken to do that. But I'm talking about him and you and your sister and the others to get out in the middle of the field there, because you were pretty roughly dealt with and carted off to jail.
Yeah, they were. The worst bit was that they dragged me around the side of the thing, and the rugby union spectators came down and spat on me as I was being dragged past. I didn't feel particularly, you know, I'd been arrested enough before to know that the police at the time really disapproved of you, but they were a bit anxious about roughing you up too much because they knew you probably had, you know, access to media.
Well, you're on TV, well, especially that was on TV.
They were always terribly. They thought that we weren't ladylike, and of course that was the worst thing that could happen in 1971, is to be considered not ladylike. Yeah,
but
and then I got 2 months jail from the.
2 months in jail.
Well, that's the sentence I got because we had a mad magistrate, but there were lots of mad magistrates in those days.
How did you spend 2 months in jail?
No, I spent a couple of days in jail, and then we appealed, and eventually it went to a stated case, you know, and it was commuted to a suspended sentence. So it's still on my record as...
But incredibly brave and incredibly powerful activism, and the beginning of a very, very long career in that space. You're at uni, you study industrial relations, join the Labor Party.
Yeah, I was studying politics, or government as it was called at Sydney Uni. I joined the Labor Party in 1971.
What made you do that?
Well, there was nothing else to join. It was before any other...
Not the communists?
it's quite interesting. I was obviously a fellow traveller because they invited me to all their parties, and I used to go and to their events, Lennon's birthday and things like that. But what actually happened was there was a funny old trot called Bob Gould. You've no doubt heard of Bob Gould. And he came round to our share house one day in would have been early 1971. And I just knew he wouldn't leave until we all said yes. He was trying to get us into the party. He was stacking it for some reason. I mean, a good reason to be in the party is for a stack, because that's what's still going on. So I joined the party, and we had a very interesting time for about 2 or 3 years trying to win the Glebe North branch of the Labor Party away from the old corrupt right-wingers. And we won, but then we didn't know what to do with it, so they got it back again. And then I didn't really, I remained in the party, but I've never been terribly active in the party, strangely. I was very, very active in the union movement because when I was at Macquarie, I became president of the New South Wales branch of the Academics Union, which was then called a number of things. It's now called NTEU.
NTEU, yeah.
But, so I became I was the first woman president, and I used to go to Labor Council every Thursday night for 13 years. I actually have a scroll of honour from Labor Council, which is the Trades and Labor Council. And the fights there were very interesting because they were about being women. And it was at the time when white-collar unions were coming into the union movement, and the old guys, even the old left guys, were very resistant to it.
Because chauvinism, misogyny, it's something that you've just always lent into.
But also they didn't believe that sitting at a desk was real work. They'd always say to you, but sitting at a desk isn't real work, having a hammer or a drill or whatever, and, a jackhammer was real work. So I found that and just as prevalent, can I say, amongst the old left as it was amongst the old right. And it was the left-wing blokes from the new white-collar unions that behaved best through it all, and they're still good friends, people like Barry Cotter and Michael Raper, and they were very good, Richard Walsham. But the old left blokes, gee. And everyone would say, don't you think, Laurie Carmichael's a great bloke? And I'd say, yeah, well, but they treated us like shit, the women. They actually didn't believe we should be unionists or that we were workers.
Or value your work.
No, of course not. And then they'd ask you to type something for them,
But just a different time, but you were at the front of, transforming ideas about what work was, and who should represent workers, and that was women. So an incredibly important change in terms of feminism and empowering. Another area that you were working on in that time was, as a unionist, was the green bands.
Oh yes, I have to tell you about the green bands, and
then
I'll get back to talking about
chauvinism
feminism and very funny.
But
story.
the 1970s, because there were two things happened. The people might not understand that the environment movement was born out of, yes, certainly our understanding of the natural environment and protecting it, trees and whales and all these things. But it was also the built environment, making sure that they didn't turn our cities into massive shitholes. And in Sydney in the 1970s, there was a wrecking ball going through some of our most beautiful suburbs. They wanted to level Woolloomooloo, the Rocks, parts of Erskineville, Glebe, the whole thing. And the green bands was the trade union movement saying...
It wasn't the trade union movement. The trade union movement opposed every single green band, it was a particular union. It was the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation, which I suppose I'd better go back a bit. New South Wales Builders Labourers was quite a small union. At its height, it was probably only about 3,000. A guy who you've probably heard of called Jack Mundy
Of course.
becomes the secretary in 1968, and he has around him an incredible union leadership. You know, Bob Pringle was the president, and he was in the Labor Party. Jack, of course, was in the Communist Party. Joe Owens, the secretary that took over from Jack, was in the Communist Party. But it was what used to be called a popular front. But they got on very well. It didn't really matter whether you're in the Labor Party or the Communist Party. And there were quite a number of guys who called themselves anarcho-syndicalists also in the leadership. And they had become very radical. They had began thinking about union democracy. They'd brought in a limited tenure of office motion, which meant that you could only do 2 terms in office and then you got out. And can I say, I think that was one of the reasons the rest of the trade union movement opposed them, because the other trade union leaders weren't keen on that at all.
They were just little fiefdoms appointed for life.
They weren't keen on that. So they worked on democracy first, and which was what I was particularly interested with. I ended up doing my PhD on them, and then with my sister Verity writing the book about them, because they really were an amazing union. And 50 years later, I'm still being asked mainly from people overseas about them, and we're going to talk in Iceland or somewhere about the builders' labourers. But anyway, Jack decides that one of the things. No, I'll go back a bit before that. What happens is that a bunch of middle-class women at Kelly's Bush decide they want to, in Hunters Hill, decide they want to keep the last remaining bushland on the harbour at Kelly's Bush, and against a proposal from Meriton to build flats. And they ring around and no one takes any notice of them, except they eventually ring the builders' labourers. That, you know, they got their number in the phone book sort of thing, rang them. And Bob Pringle went out and spoke to them, and he got very convinced that, you know, this was a good thing to do. And he comes back and suggests to the union that they put a black ban on Kelly's Bush, and they all agree to it. And that was just the beginning. It snowballs from there. And
so that is no work. We're not going to work on this, you know.
And they'll pick it. And one of the important things that distinguished those green bans from later green bans was that they did defend them physically, and there were a number of very physical battles. But, you know, after Kelly's Bush, you get East Lakes, then you get, you know, Woolloomooloo, the Rocks, Centennial Park. Centennial Park was going to be a big sports arena. Glebe, the two expressways were going to go through Glebe. Lots of historic buildings along the way. Eventually there were 54 green bans, which all defended, mind you. Very dramatic, lots of arrests. And the interesting thing was how good the leadership were at articulating why they were doing it. I mean, whenever you had Jack, particularly on television, he would convince anyone. He was, and Joe and Bob were equally good in their different ways.
He had it, as the kids call it today, he had a lot of riz, a lot of charisma.
A lot of riz, is it?
There's a lot of riz. he exuded a lot of riz. He was a real leader, and he brought people with him. And he was a super left wing trade unionist, but he was bringing people from the suburbs and across society with him, arguing that, you know, for this important heritage, and
he could charm the birds from the trees. He really could, and he took a lot of people with him. And one of the things that I didn't realise, and I've been a good friend of Jack's for 50 years until he died, and I didn't realise till I really looked at the stuff how he managed to keep back channels open. He, for instance, had a very good relationship with Dusseldorp, had a Lend-Lease, and he managed to get things from him, which would then flow through to the rest of the building industry. But the other thing was he was everyone knows he got on well with Tom Uren, the old lefty boxer who became the Minister for Urban and Regional Development. But Jack also had a very good relationship with Neville Wran, and it was as a result of that relationship that Neville Wran promised to build the Sirius building as purpose-built for public housing, because Jack and he had agreed on this. And it was purpose-built for public housing, and then the Liberal government a couple of years ago decided to sell it because the views are too good for working class people. I mean,
they kick out all the social housing and
they
sell
kicked
each
out
one off for a
all
couple of $1 million,
Yeah.
and just outrageous.
Yeah, they made a
Terrible.
huge amount out of it. It was disgusting, really. And it's actually a building I like, even though a lot of people
No, I don't mind
don't
it either.
like that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool.
brutality, Yeah. So
1970s brutalism,
yes,
the Pebblecrete. I don't mind it.
No, I quite like it. And but the Builders Labourers was very important, and the left in Sydney really coalesced around the Builders Labourers. It was sort of like Vietnam was over, the Springboks had gone, we moved on, and then we all became involved with the Builders Labourers. And the Labourers were good at using people. I became one of I used to write a lot of their propaganda. I was always writing leaflets and things. Robert Tickner, who later became a federal cabinet minister, he used to
I'm working with him on his corrective services reforms at the moment.
Good,
actually,
good.
yeah.
Well,
Great
that's
guy.
how I met Robert.
Aboriginal Affairs Minister in Keating government.
Robert was doing volunteer typing in the office. Well, he was a uni student. He'd go in and do the typing. Lots and lots of lefty lawyers did all the work for free, including, defending us when we got arrested. And in fact, a couple of days ago, we had the 50th anniversary lunch of it was quite a sad commemoration of the final meeting before they went out of 24th of March 1975, they went out of existence. And we had the lunch on the 25th. And I invited all the old lefty lawyers who'd appeared for us, and they're all judges now, or were judges, and which is quite interesting. And there were a lot of them and fewer of the Builders Labourers, because Builders Labourers don't look after themselves.
No.
Most of them have died now, which is really sad.
Yeah, my dad was in the BLF he worked on the bridge reconstruction in Hobart. He's been a rigger and a crane.
They were the elite. They looked down on everyone else.
Exactly. He did no work, blew a whistle, and made $100 an hour. But incredibly important movement. Like if anyone is looking at the history of environmentalism, protection of the urban environment, that is a moment that even the Greens parties all around the world, they point to as the precursor of their movement and a model of how you activate a community, build consensus from the grassroots in terms of grassroots democracy.
Well, when Petra Kelly came out to Australia,
who started the German Greens, she was so taken with the idea of them being called green bands that's when she went back and called her party the Greens Party. So really, the Greens worldwide get their name from the green bands, which was it's a bit ironic because one of the leaders of the Greens Party in Australia was also part of the Socialist Party of Australia, which opposed all the green bands. Who was that?
Oh, I'm not going to say. You might say, but she knows who she is. And they opposed every single green band. They said it was left adventurism.
Really?
Because the SPA were the Stalinists who stayed with Russia when the Communist Party split. So
I think I know who you're talking about.
But that's also one of the reasons why the Builders Labourers dies is because of the splits in the Communist Party. It was, as I say, I've written PhD and a book about it. And if anyone wants to get the book, it's still available because 20 years after it first came out, we had to reissue it because we were always getting requests from students or from people overseas. We're really interested in it because it is the first case of unions taking action on environmental grounds. The book's called Green Band's Red Union. There you are. I've got
your plug in.
Got my plug in, and it's by Meredith and Verity Burgmann. But it will be I think one of the key ideological and political things that people in 1,000 years, if they're looking back at anything that came out of Australia that was of global significance, it was the Green Bands.
It was the Green Bands. It really
Absolutely.
was. It was whereby communities stood up against crony capitalism and belligerent governments and said, just piss off. You know, there's a community here. This isn't just a building site, not a development opportunity for you on your way to, you know, to billions of dollars, and won.
That's right.
And if anyone's, you know, enjoying the Rocks or Woolloomooloo and some of these suburbs now are the most exclusive and sought after.
I know.
And they were going to turn them into car parks and freeways.
Mainly executive high-rise buildings.
High-rise buildings.
But one of the other things I should also mention is, of course, that the Builders Labourers were the first union and probably still the only union to take action to defend gay rights, because a student at Macquarie University called Jeremy Fisher, he was in one of the colleges, and the college, which was a very low church Anglican college, expelled him for being gay. They had found something he'd written in the local, you know, the university newspaper, so they expelled him. And the union said, okay, we're going to stop work on all the building work at Macquarie University until he gets his position back. And, of course, there was lots of work going on because it was – and I was teaching out at Macquarie at that stage. It was just a big building site, really. And so Jeremy eventually gets allowed back into the college, but he, of course, then doesn't go back in. Why would you want to when they'd but he wrote a lovely...
But that's in like the 70s when, you know, being gay was a crime.
Yes, it was
still in the
73, I think.
73. It was still in the Crimes Act, you know, punishable with years in jail for all of these things, you know, buggery and all the rest of it. Just an absolutely medieval approach to
he was
sexuality.
A very male union. I can still remember the arguments in the pub about it was the ban that got the most pushback from the rank and file, but in the end, the rank and file voted for it because the leadership just kept saying, you know, why, blah blah blah, you know, two men not doing any harm to anyone else, blah blah, and eventually the rank and file, a lot of migrant workers too, they all just ended up supporting the leadership, which that was really remarkable. And Jeremy wrote an email for the lunch we had, you know, a couple of days ago, and it was really quite touching because he said what a terrible dark time in his life it had been. So we keep forgetting in situations like that how much it affects the person at the heart of it all.
True, Meredith. We might just take this opportunity to have a top up of the beer and the wine because I've run a bit. And that's a really important point you make about, you know, changing attitudes in the union movement, in society, to the gay community, because 1978, you're one of the 78ers.
Yes.
Which is unbelievable. So you're dismantling apartheid, you're creating the environment movement, and then you're getting bashed and arrested, marching with the 78ers, 1978, which was the first Mardi Gras down Oxford Street.
Look, I wasn't arrested, and I need to...
Well, you were under threat. Obviously.
No, I need to. I have to keep explaining this to people. That the original march in the morning of that day was basically a civil liberties march. It was. I'd gone along to it because, you know, our slogan as we marched down the street was stop police attacks on gays, women and blacks. And I was very good friends with a gay lawyer at the time called John Terry, and he had, I don't know, said, come on down. So we all went down. So if you actually look at the original list of the 78ers, they've expanded the 78ers now to people from later on in that year. But that original march, and then the march later on in the evening, which ends up in Taylor Square, there was a lot of people there who are trots or anarchists or civil libertarians like me, really. My sister and brother-in-law who were at the time terrible trots. I mean, they're 78ers, and they reckon they're going to come up for the 50th anniversary, and we're all going to sort of struggle down. It's hard work, the Mardi Gras. But then my real job was, I'd obviously been, I'm trying to, a lot of this you have to retrace in your own mind because, you know, for years and years and years it wasn't significant, and suddenly it becomes, oh, the 78ers. But
it was just another one of the causes you've been to.
But also,
you've probably been to 10 protests that week.
That's right. They tend to meld into each other. But what happened was I found a whole bunch of bail slips. We used to collect things called blueies in those days. I always said I was going to wallpaper my wall with blueies, which are the sort of
the court attendance notice, weren't
things
they?
like that.
I had one or two of those, but not for protesting.
I found a whole lot of them where I bailed out a lot of people on that night. I was there in the police station bailing people out, and I bailed out Peter Murphy, who was a friend of mine, and he was the person who was extremely badly bashed, like really badly bashed. And I took him to St Vincent's, and then I took him down to, because they weren't great, can I say. So then I took him down to a doctor I knew in Glebe called Paul Torzillo, who is still doing wonderful things, fixing up people in these situations. And then I took him, and this must have been like 7 o'clock in the morning by this stage. Peter decided he wanted to take legal action, so I took him to see Pat O'Shane, the Aboriginal lawyer who then later became a magistrate, and we went and saw Pat about, you know, taking action against the police. So that was my part in the actual, the awful part of the evening was basically bailing people out.
But it was a protest that had started, you know, pretty small, marching down Oxford Street.
It was great. And people came out of the...
out of all the gay bars.
Cabaret rooms and everything.
That's Stonewall. It all came out saying, yes, it was organic. And it got big, and the cops thought, well, this is getting out of control.
I have a theory, actually, which I've run past one of my judge mates, Greg Woods, who writes the history of criminal law in New South Wales. But I said, I think the police did it deliberately because they were in a fight with Neville Wran about the future of the Summary Offences Act. They wanted to keep the Summary Offences Act so that they could just arrest anyone they wanted to at any time for the trifecta. You know, what is it? Assault police, bad language, something else. Anyway, but they wanted to keep... Public
disturbance or whatever it was.
They wanted to keep the Summary Offences Act as it was, and Frank Walker, the reforming Attorney General, wanted to abolish it. And I think the police deliberately made that riot happen in order to be able to say to the politicians, see, we need this. We need the Summary Offences Act to be able to control these awful people.
Because it's a really important point, because I'm talking to a Labor or politicians at the moment, like Stephen Lawrence and others at the moment, about indecent language. Like the indecent language being a charge, because for so many people, especially Aboriginal Australians, you pulled up and you say, get fucked, or, you know, whatever it is.
Fuck, what's this?
What's this? And or you're arguing with someone, having an argument, you say, oh, you know, you're a dickhead and blah, 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 and fuck you and all the rest. And off you go. And then I'm arresting you for that. And then you say...
no, you're not. Boom,
boom.
And then it's
assault. And then it's assault.
It's the trifecta.
And then it's resist arrest.
Yeah.
And then, you know, and then you might go for a little run down the road and you've tried to, you know, escape the police. Yeah, it's an interesting one, like in a modern context that you can be
What
arrested.
is offensive? Seriously,
I know.
what is offensive?
That you can't
they
say fuck.
They say it on television.
Yeah, we're saying
know.
here on the podcast, fuck,
Yes.
and arrest me. But the Mardi Gras, you were there, you were involved.
Sorry.
No,
Important things I did was and I've just done this from the documents because for my sins I'm writing the memoir. But I found the documents where Paul O'Grady, who was the first openly gay member of Parliament anywhere in Australia, he was a member of the New South Wales Upper House. In 1992, he writes to the other members of Parliament saying, I intend to march in the Mardi Gras. Will you march with me? And I was one of three other New South Wales parliamentarians who said yes. And there was so five of us marched, and one of them was a Democrat from South Australia who was a friend of Paul's, but the three of us marched. So I say I'm a proud 1992er as well as a proud 78ers.
Well,
because it was difficult for the first. I mean, seriously, straight people shouldn't march in the Mardi Gras because we just look really strange walking along in ordinary clothes and occasionally waving. So after that, I used to take a wand and wear fairy wings.
Don't
and
worry,
things like
2
that.
weeks ago I marched in green tights and a blue wig. So
Yes.
Just
you've got to do something like that to get because I've marched many times since.
It is a long walk too. It's hard.
It's a long
My
walk,
hip was giving out at the end.
But also, you feel very silly because, as politicians, we were. And can I say, Albo was one of the first
PM and
members of Parliament, or first, even before he went into Parliament, he always marched in the Mardi Gras.
Yeah.
He's always been very good on that.
So 78ers, you're fighting for gay rights. You've built a successful career in academia and unionism. There, how did you find yourself lined up to be an MP? Because you're elected to Parliament in 1991, the New South Wales Legislative Council. How did you get into that trouble?
Yeah, well, first of all, quickly going back to the 78ers,
Yep.
I always feel a bit strange about that, as I say, because people always just immediately assume you're gay. And I have to say, oh, well, no, I was sort of, because we didn't have the word allies then. You didn't know what to call yourself. I'd say I was just a hanger-onerer.
Just not a bigot.
Yes. Anyway, what was the question? How did I?
I can't remember, Meredith. Oh no, I was building up to how you got into Parliament.
Oh, how did I get into Parliament? It was very easy. I was a very happy academic at Macquarie. Can I say my comrades there were fantastic. I loved working there. I don't think I had an argument in the entire 18 years I worked there.
Be very active in the NTEU. And
I was active in the union, but also we were doing really good stuff in the School of History, Philosophy and Politics. And everyone's, I don't know, it was just a really lefty place to be working in. And I found out many years later it was the most feminised university in Australia. And that was because it didn't have the big male faculties. It didn't have medicine and ag and vet and engineering and those things. And also it was recruiting staff at the time when women were beginning to have finished their postgraduate degrees. So it was really interesting. So a lot of people like me got into academic jobs there.
Because nowadays, I think a lot of young people would assume that, women have always had a degree and always got a PhD. But we're talking in the 1980s, the first cohort of women that have gone to university and got a doctorate.
No, I started in 1974 at Macquarie, so 73 actually. And we were still sort of pretty unusual there. I loved it at Macquarie. How did I end up in Parliament? Well, as I say, there was a knock on the door one day would have been 1990, and Albo was there. He often used to drop in because my place was on the route between his office and his mum's place, where he often used to go and visit his mum, who's lovely. But very strangely, he asked me to go to lunch, which, you know, mostly he'd just come and eat all my food. And so we went out, and then he put to me that I should be on the ticket for the upper house. And I remember saying to him, "Oh, that's really nice," and I feel flattered and everything.
I mean, I'm just going to jump in because this is before Albo's in Parliament. He's a Labor Party organiser.
He's the assistant secretary. So he's the leader of the left, basically, in New South Wales. And
but a rising
it was a job
star,
he was very good at.
Yeah, he was a very good organiser in the Labor Party, but young, rising star.
He's 16 years younger than me, which, you know, whenever anyone says, "Who's your mentor?" I say, well, I suppose it's Albo, but he's 16 years younger than me, and they're not meant to be mentors at that age.
He might say the same thing about you.
He just said, "No, you're the only person that can beat," and I won't say whose name it was. So you really need to stand, which I thought was a nice way of saying, ooh. He now has said in other interviews that he wanted me in there because I was a signal to other people about the Whitlamite and sort of Vietnam years and thing. And to some degree, I suppose I was, you know, that if you're trying to say to young people, this is a party of protest and things, then I might have been quite good at that. But at the time he just said, "Oh, you're the only person who can win it." So I said, "Well, I'm very flattered, but I'm an academic." And he went away. And that weekend, as I always say, I marked, I think, about 300 first-year essays. And by the time he came back the following week, I'd really thought about it. And I thought, yes, it would be really interesting. And so I agreed. And he just organised it all. I have no idea what happened. He just did it.
Made the magic happen.
Made the magic happen, and I ended up in Parliament, and I, you know, the sausage.
But you're coming in with Greiner.
No, Greiner was already there.
Yeah, but it was like
Greiner was the
Premier.
Was the Premier.
Was Premier.
Right. That's right.
You go into the New South Wales upper house. Pretty stuffy institution in 1990, more like 1890s. It was closer to 1890s than...
That's what everyone always talks about. But even by that stage, the parties had decided that this was the place you put your apparatchiks. And so both parties and all factions were putting their apparatchiks in. A little bit for diversity too. That became, within about 5 to 10 years, it became a real issue about diversity. And it's true. If you think you can't get a Chinese member into the lower house, that's what you do. You have them in the upper house. And it has always been a very diverse chamber for the last 30 years.
Still is.
Still is.
Few people
very diverse.
Openly gay, you know, the all probably, definitely more diverse.
So when I went in, it was, as I say, beginning to be where the operators were, and it made it pretty interesting. And also we were a lot younger than the lower house was, because the lower house often has some old bloke that, he's the only one that can win the seat, he'd better stay there.
And someone who's been in the seat for 30 years and knows everyone and goes to the Rotary changeover dinners and,
whereas that person in the upper house would be told to move on, because in those days we could. When they had the old superannuation scheme, which I still think we should have kept, because what it enabled the parties to do was move their old buggers on. You know, you were able to
pension them off.
Yes, you were able to tap them on the shoulder and say, "Sorry, mate, you've got your pension. Look, we really need to put a young Indian woman in here," and you can't anymore because the super's shit. Because everyone says, "Oh no, it's the same as everywhere else." Yes, but you come into Parliament a lot later than you do in most other occupations. So I just thought it was Mark Latham's idea, so of course it's a silly idea.
I know.
Yes.
And he's on the pension.
He's got the good one.
He's got the good pension that gives me the shit. So, Mark, hand it back.
Yes.
You're into the New South Wales upper house. It was a it was a very transformative time. One of the issues that was emerging, of course, was police corruption, drug law reform. It's leading into the Wood Royal Commission. The issues around King's Cross being a hub of vice, still prostitution illegal. But you took the lead. You took the lead on drug law reform, didn't you?
No.
No.
No, the person who took the lead on drug law reform was the wonderful Anne Simons, who was my fellow.
Well, you're very humble there, but weren't you one of the first MPs to, join the Friends of Drug Law Reform?
Oh, yeah. No, I was very close to Anne, and she made my first few years in Parliament bearable because everyone hated me. I had a pretty tough time, but Anne was wonderful.
Why'd they hate you?
I was a woman. They still didn't like that. I was a left-winger. They didn't like that. I was an Albo left-winger and not a Ferguson left-winger. So, and the numbers at that time was 17 of them to 3 of us. But worst of all, do you know what? I wasn't a Catholic. I was, when I went into Parliament, the caucus of 65 had 7 people in it who were not of a Catholic background. And they really didn't trust me because I was not of a Catholic background. Yeah, I just decided this is not a place where you make friends. And, I made friends in strange places, like a few right-wingers and, an occasional lib. But Anne was wonderful. She was my best friend. And she looked every bit the Bronte housewife that she always said she was. She always wore a lovely skirt and top. She always wore stockings and high. She always looked wonderful. And she had long black hair that was always up in a bun. And she led the campaign for drug law reform, for prison reform for women and, especially women with children. She really ran that campaign. But she was the wonderful person to be talking about drug law reform because she would never have said, oh, but you're just an old druggie. Anyway, Anne got me involved. Of course I believed in drug law reform because it just seemed to me obvious.
You must have had a herbal cheroot once or twice in your past.
Look, not much because, can I say, when I was at uni, we sort of looked down on the druggies because they weren't very good activists. They'd lie around going, oh, heavy man, And we were out there putting up posters and, wearing ourselves out. So I've always really enjoyed alcohol, but I've never, of course I've had marijuana and of course cocaine, pitchery, which is the, Aboriginal drug of the centre and Northern Territory.
What does that do to you?
Oh, it was really good. It was a bit like cocaine.
Was it?
Yes, you've got to really get into it. No, I like that. And of course I've tried most things, but only, and I've never been
dabbled.
Yeah, as everyone does when they're young. But no, I was never. I to some degree, marijuana made me a bit lethargic, and I like to be a bit sort of buzzy. So I preferred cocaine or gin. Gin's the best. Anyway, so.
But it didn't stop you seeing the need for reform across the board.
And the interesting thing was my father, who was really, as I say, he was a secret Labor voter, but he was quite a conservative person. He said years and years before anyone else talked about it, he said, it all needs to be legalised because then the criminals won't be involved. But, he said that really early, so I'd always believed that. Anyway, Anne got me involved, and she got me involved in an organisation which we started, called the Parliamentary Group for Drug Law Reform. And we had our first All-Australian meeting down in Canberra in, gosh, I should have looked this up. It's in the early 1990s.
Probably in a phone box.
Yeah. Well, there were 18, 19 of us from all over Australia.
That's not too bad.
And the speaker at the dinner that night was Michael Kirby, who was terrific. He
Wasn't a High Court justice then. Was he?
No, but he was a
just a
judge.
Judge, yep.
And he talked about it and was very open and said, we are making the mistake that the Americans made about alcohol. You cannot solve a problem by a prohibition. And he was so right. Anyway, so I continued to be involved in the group for drug law reform, and it was the work of people like Anne and, of course, Alex Wodak, who was terrific, who got the drug summit happening 25 years ago. And from out of that, we got the drug medically supervised injecting room. And then 25 years later, we get, hopefully, pill testing. It's hard work. It's very slow stuff.
It's a slog. There's no doubt about it. We've had Alex on the podcast and also Matt Knopfs on talking about the reform. And yes, we're hoping that Chris Minns develops a bit more of a spine when it comes to drug law reform. He said some interesting things in opposition about cannabis prohibition being an absolute failure, which you don't have to be Einstein to work that out. But he's now saying it's a big change, and so a little bit concerning, a little bit tepid in his approach.
He's very cautious, Chris, but if you can convince him, he could be okay. And of course,
I'm trying to convince him that it's a working class issue. I keep saying again and again.
Oh
and
yes,
again.
because it's working class people who get pinched.
It's a working class drug because
That's right, because the upper class are all on cocaine.
They're
which is
on
$1 million a tab sort of thing. Yes.
That's exactly right. And the working class, it's just part of the economy out in the working class there. But look, I think Chris is he knows what's right. He's just I think he'll get
very cautious.
He's cautious, but
I think you'll get him there.
I think we'll get him there.
Yeah.
Now, there's one thing that, like, you go into the New South Wales upper house, it's changing. Like, it's becoming more representative. It's at least elected. There's more diversity, but it's still, like, it's just full of misogyny, full of sexism, full of, some of the things that you've railed against in your life. You start the Ernie Awards.
Oh, yes.
Strangely,
the Ernies weren't aimed at parliamentarians. In fact, I found parliamentarians awful, but they were no more sexist than, say, the trade union movement or the Ernies began
which was an award for the most egregious misogyny uttered
of the year.
It's still going, isn't it?
No.
Have you given it up?
2 years ago, at its 30th year, 30 years, yay, we all decided we were all too tired and we just gave it up. And it's good that it just finishes there, because if other people had done it, they mightn't have understood the nuances and all the in-jokes and everything that kept it going for the 30 years. What happened was that a terrible old bloke called Ernie Ecob, check this one for defo, it's all right, he's died, and his family actually quite likes the fact that the Ernie's is named after him.
Ernie Ecob.
Yeah, a couple of times they've come. Anyway, he announced his retirement, and he was the secretary of the Shearers Union, and he used to say, the only reason women want to be shearers is for the sex, And as we say, we thought that's what the sheep were for. But anyway, he retired, and a unionist woman called Vicky Telfer said, we should have a little lunch to celebrate. And so we had a little lunch, and 45 union women turned up. It was a very trade union thing. And, I'd organised it at Parliament, and we had such a good time. And I'd found this trophy with a sheep on the top. It was obviously some shearer's trophy, but to us it was the Ernie for Ernie Ecob. And we gave it at that lunch to Joe de Bruyn, who was a dreadful
SDA, wasn't he?
Yeah, shop assistance guy. And he'd said some terrible thing about childcare taking away the right of parents to bring up their own children, that sort of shit.
He was to the right of Genghis Khan,
He was
wasn't
terrible.
he?
Almost everything.
But I couldn't believe SDA, so many young women in his union.
But they don't really get a say. I mean,
No,
it's
I
a
know.
long story about the SDA. I could go on. Anyway, we, after giving the trophy, everyone had had such a good time that the following year we did it again, but at night, 400 people turned up. And then for the next 30 years, 400 people turned up because it was all the Parliament could take. And, we had different categories and eventually the trade union guys really fixed up their language, and also because the union movement really began to be headed by women. I mean, if you look at it now, had Sharon Barrow and now Sally McManus, and it's very much now the average unionist is a woman white-collar unionist, whereas in the old days it was blokes with tats and white blokes with tats. And so the trade unionists don't say anything terrible anymore. But politicians are still pretty good. Chefs are still very good in terms of dreadful things they say. Sporting heroes still say terrible things. Judges have got a lot better. Originally, judges always won because they said terrible things and they had such control over women's lives. The Ernies has been a really interesting, as I say, 30 years of women turning up, drinking too much.
Well, there's no better way to pillory, discrimination than through great humour.
But also, you needed to have the evidence, and we were always able to. They'd say, "Oh, what terrible thing has so and so said," and we'd read it out, and they'd go, "Oh, did he really say that?"
Score it out of 10.
Because I was always very careful. We'd read out over the night. We'd read out probably 50, 60 quotes, and we always had to really make sure they were right. Otherwise, you got sued.
Defo.
And I only got I got threatened with being sued by, of all people, Erica Betts.
Oh.
It's the only time, because we were always really careful to make certain it was inside Parliament. Or, that sort of.
Her bets. He's a minister in Tasmania again.
He's the Minister for Fisheries.
I know. He's in charge of the salmon.
Saw him on the telly.
You need to talk to Albo about that.
Yes. I'm rather hopeful it all might change after the election.
I hope so. But Erica Betts, he's been meddling in public life for too long, longer than you. He's just been eternal. He's like Methuselah. Look, as a legislative councillor, 1999, you get elected to the president of the Legislative Council.
Yes.
How on earth did that happen? What a descent into chaos that must have been. Because you came in, and the first thing you do, you take down the picture of the Queen, you get rid of the 305 guns salute, you stop tugging the forelock, the whole thing. The Conservatives must have been out the front with burning torches and pitchforks.
They were. The interesting thing is, I might tell you later how it ended up that I ended up president, but I, at the opening of Parliament, which the president organises, the previous president, Max Willis, who I actually quite liked, he was just, he was a Queenie. He desperately loved the Queen, so there were 400 pictures of the Queen in my office. But he had a RAF fly past. This was at the opening of Parliament. He'd had
no way.
Oh yeah, the whole
really?
thing. He'd had
streaking colours.
Yeah,
the whole
yeah.
No shit.
Yeah, the whole thing, and he'd had
on the taxpayer dime.
All done, yes, and he'd had serried ranks of all the military marching up and down
with the
probably.
I was there last year for the King came.
Yeah.
to the Legislative Council. Were you there?
I ended up going there. I didn't know the King was meant to be there. I'd gone because it was 200th anniversary of the Legislative Council.
That's right.
Which I thought I should go to. And the head of the chief judge of the New South Wales court, I think his name was Bell, made this wonderful speech about how terrible the first Legislative Council had been, 200 years ago. There was 9 old blokes that were just nominated. It wasn't democracy or anything. And the first thing they do was declare a state of emergency so that they could go out and kill Aborigines.
Oh, I did that.
Yeah,
That was me.
You wrote that.
No.
didn't
I was the one that lobbied that they at least recognise what the first decision they made, which was to declare martial law
so that they
on the
could go-
Wiradjuri
Yeah.
and commit genocide. They actually got the Legislative Council together in the beginning
I know.
so that they could
And
have the
here we
pastoral
were-
leases.
Here we were with, silly old Charles up there, and it was us celebrating that as democracy.
I know. And they actually had the guys come out with the little the king. It was interesting. Cameron Murphy was there. He's a
Good friend of mine.
rabid Republican, an Irishman, and he didn't stand when the king came in. Everyone stood up, under pressure, and Murphy just sat. I thought that was pretty cool.
I mean,
But anyway, you
I
thought the Parliament could do with a bit of modernisation. Down with the Queen,
no, what I
up
did-
with
no, I did-
Aboriginal
I
art.
did a few things that they quite approved of, which I got rid of the fly past and all that stuff. And instead of having all the army marching down the street, I got the Rural Fire Service band to play.
What a
Because
good idea.
There'd been, fires that
Fires
year.
and
So that all went well. But the thing that the media really attacked me for, I organised for 4 women from the Metropolitan Land Council to greet the governor as he arrived. And they said that was turning it into a circus. But we forget, this is 1999, so it's 26 years ago.
yeah.
We forget that, when I did when I recognised country, when I opened Parliament, that was the first time it had ever happened in a Parliament. They were horrified. But
Say that again. The first time you did a welcome to country.
we did a welcome
you
to
reckon-
country at the opening.
and an acknowledgement at the beginning of the Parliament.
I got these 4 really well dressed. They had teal jackets on. They were just so respectable, and they welcomed the Sir Gordon Samuels. And the media attacked me for turning it into a circus. But the thing they hated the most was you're meant to invite representatives of the diplomatic corps, but you can only invite 5 because, there's everyone wanting to pile in. And I looked at the list, and the previous president hadn't ever invited any. Max always used to say, I'm not going to have communists in my parliament. So he'd never invited Vietnam or Cuba to be one of the people. So I invited the 2 women. They were both women consuls, and I knew them both. And then I think the Thai, because they were the head of the diplomatic corps, and the British and the American. So I invite them. Well, I end up having my own party moving motions against me because I'd invited it was the Vietnamese they really hated. And I kept saying, but isn't the Cold War over? But the fact I'd invited the Vietnamese Consul General to the opening of Parliament, when they were the Consul General, we'd accepted them into Australia, Anyway,
and a huge Vietnamese community, not that they're, they're particularly...
Well, that was the problem because it was all being pushed by the
South.
Anyway, so the opening of Parliament was, for me, one of those things that are just a scar on my soul, and I keep remembering them.
The acknowledgement. There's a lot of pushback at the moment, against acknowledgements of country, and I just think, well, why not? Why not recognise at important moments,
Jeremy,
all
it's
of
a
this.
bunch of racists who all voted against the referendum and now going, yay, yay, we can stop. You know, they never wanted to have welcome to country or
They
acknowledgement
think
of country.
they're off the leash,
They're
aren't
off and
they?
running. They're off
Mate.
and running. And I only looked at 5 seconds of the Peter Dutton speech.
It was a
the other
good
night.
good tactic by Albo,
But-
wasn't it? Dropping the
Yes,
election.
but I only
before.
looked at 5 seconds because I knew I wouldn't be able to bear it. And I turned it on. It was, and that terrible divisive referendum which has caused racism in our country. And I thought, it didn't cause racism. Anyway.
But you
Yeah.
serve as the president of the Legislative
Yes.
Council, 1999 through to 2007, longest serving female president.
That's right, yeah. Looking
Do you-
back,
I've got to tell you something that I did, though, that I'm pretty proud of. I had Virginia Chadwick recognised with a bust because it's how can I describe it? The Legislative Council, total sausage fest when it comes to all the busts in the top. They had
I will now tell you the story of me trying to get a women's bust up there before it was when, I can't remember what year it would have been probably 2003, something like that. I worked out there were 14 male busts in the parliament and no women.
Yeah.
So I said, let's have the first woman elected to the Legislative Council. Us being the Legislative Council, it seemed a good idea. And
Why
thank
not?
goodness it was a Labor woman called Catherine Green.
Really?
And I got the portraits of her. And although it was very hard because she was a working class woman, so there weren't pictures of her, but we got photographs of her. And Michael Egan, who was then the treasurer, and you had to always get the treasurer to agree to stuff when we were, because you know how much a bust costs. It's
Yeah, I do. It was
$40,000,
I
$50,000.
think this one cost 140,000.
Yes, I know. But this was, and I got him to agree to it. And we went out to the Public Works Department workshop in, I think it was Alexandria, and it was like fairyland. There were all these little old Albanian stonemasons and things chipping away, making beautiful stuff. And we had a maquette made, which is the little thing made of Catherine Green and everything, and it was all happening. And, first of all, I had to agree. It was a bit of a quid pro quo with Michael. I had to agree to one of his Catholic heroes being also made into a bust. But that was all right. We agreed to that. Who'd know? Yet another male in the... But anyway, we'd come to an agreement and Michael was really supporting us. I really loved Michael Egan. He was a very nice man, but a very strange and quite conservative person. And then he stops being treasurer suddenly, and Michael Costa becomes the treasurer, and he says no busts of women, and just pissed us off. So that's why the first bust of a woman, which should have been the first woman member of the Legislative Council.
Well, I'll pick that back up because it's
Pick
still...
it back up, Catherine Green.
Catherine Green.
And it needs to happen again.
Well, there was room for one, and I thought I'd go with Virginia Chadwick.
Because the Libs would say yes to
Yeah, because the
that.
Libs would say yes. But it's up there now. But you serve as the incredibly effective, well-loved president of the Legislative Council for what was it, 8 years? For 8 years, retire in 2009. Now you're very involved in international aid and working internationally. What are you doing now?
Now, first of all, I retired in 2007.
2007, sorry.
And I did a number of things. I was asked would I be president of ACFID, which is the Australian Council for International Development, which is the old ACFOA, which we always used to know it as ACFOA. And they're the good guys. And so I agreed to do that, and it was wonderful. I met all the overseas aid agencies, and I got to know the people involved in them and worked with a lot of people I already knew. So that was great fun. But the best fun of all of that was when I was asked to be part of the Australian delegation to the United Nations conference on what was it called? On the Millennium Goals. So in 2010, I end up as the sort of head person of sitting there in the United Nations with Australia in front of you, and there I am sitting there at the United Nations, and it was very exciting for me because I'd done my master's on Bert Evatt and his time in the United Nations, so I knew the whole story of the United Nations really well. I kept thinking, oh, I'm Bert Evatt, you know. But I heard Obama twice. I heard, of course, Kevin Rudd was the foreign minister then, and he was just in his element, can I say. He loved being foreign minister. But the funniest thing was I've been very involved with the Iranian dissidents in Australia, the opposition. And, of course, we oppose everything the mullahs are doing in Iran. They execute more people per capita than anywhere in the world. But anyway, Ahmadinejad, who was the president then, was making a speech. And I thought, oh, good. And the Australian diplomat guy in charge came up to me and said, here I was sitting behind the Australia.
Well, he threw a blanket over you, I bet you.
No. He said, oh, are you all right if we walk out at the red line? And I said, oh, yes. And then I thought, what the fuck is the red line? I thought it was something really exciting. And I said, well, what's the red line? And he said, oh, the red line on your bit of paper, because they'd put a red line. And it turned out that there was going to be a walkout on Ahmadinejad as soon as he said that the Americans had done 9/11, which is evidently something the Americans do not accept. And so I was really excited about this, and I got up and walked out with 15 other countries. And as with all walkouts, no one noticed. It reminded me of the walkout we did on abortion, where every woman in the Legislative Council walked out and the newspapers didn't notice. Anyway, we walk out, and then I think, oh, well, I'll ring up Mohammed, who's my mate who got me involved with the Iranians. And I thought he was in Mortdale. So I ring him up in Mortdale and say, hey, I've just walked out on Ahmadinejad.
In the UN, New York.
No, we're in this little corridor at the side where we were all sort of peering in at what was going on. And he said, that's all right, we're outside. Come outside and join the demonstration. So I went outside and joined the demonstration against Ahmadinejad. So that was my exciting bit of United Nations activity.
Amazing.
But
truly amazing. Now, it wouldn't be fair because today's, what's the date? The 28th of
March.
28th of March, 2025. I know what the time is and the date. The election's been called.
Yes.
I've got to get your take. Your mate Albo, he's up against Dutton. He's got to beat him, has he? Do you think he'll towel him up? Because Albo is Joe Hildebrand, who I'm sure you're a fan of.
Yeah.
He said,
I actually used to be good friends with Joe. He's good fun. Yeah, I don't always agree with him.
No. I'm in that same camp. Joe Hildebrand said this. He said that Albo has been a warrior of the left. So he knows how to handle the left, and he's very nimble, very quick. That's his turf. He's been a little bit in dealing with the right, like sort of being a bit more of a centrist, I suppose you've got to be as a prime minister, and fighting the right. He's a little bit more cautious and second-guessing himself.
He doesn't know the tropes.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And it's not muscle memory for him. Do you think he can win the election? Because he's come out of the blocks pretty strong. It's a pretty strong budget. It's a pretty good Labor budget. There's a sort of soft underbelly to what the coalition are saying in terms of their energy policy and the rest. What's your take?
I think that we'll win. I think that it may not be a majority government simply because it's just hard. I agree with you about Albo that he's very agile. He's also probably the best tactician I've ever dealt with. For instance, when I was having a problem, I always used to think, oh, I'll just check what Albo says, because I just needed, and sometimes I disagreed with him, but mostly I'd go, oh, yeah. And once I said to him, oh, I'm getting better, Albo, I can think 3 steps ahead. And he said, I'm 11 steps ahead. And it was almost true. He's very, very good at being able to say, well, if we do that, they'll do this, and then we'll have to do that, and that'll be really bad. Or, he's really good at knowing how things will work out. Why I think we'll win, I think he'll be a better campaigner than he was last time, because he's learned from what happened last time. He is better prepared and more agile. But I think why we'll win is it's almost impossible for Dutton to win either 22 seats, not counting any of the Teals, because I don't think any of the Teals will lose their seats. He's either got to do that, or he's got to win, a dozen seats, and then convince a whole lot of cranky crossbenchers to support him. I just think that's too hard. I think that we're going into it with so many advantages, and the advantage of incumbency is really important. We've got too many. I was actually looking at the sports bet odds. I probably shouldn't be talking about this. You're probably against gambling, but No,
I'm not against gambling. I'm for, like, me personally, like, I've had a punt every now and then, and I know the odds are $1.95 at both.
No, but
right now
I'm looking at the odds for each electorate.
Oh,
which is much more interesting. And it's quite clear that the incumbents are going to win, except in about half a dozen cases from Sportsbet.
Yeah,
and Sportsbet's a pretty good way to look at things. But that's not going to be enough for Dutton to win. He's got to win in order to be able to argue that he has the right to form a government with the crossbench, which don't like him anyway. Let's face it, which crossbenchers are going to like him?
No, you've got maybe
two or three.
Catter maybe.
But Catter even likes Albo.
Yeah, that's right. Catter's, people forget that Catter's like an ex-Nat and hates the Nats. He's fighting the Nats.
And the Nats all hate
and they
the
all
Libs
hate
anyway.
Yeah,
yes,
that's exactly.
I know.
Well, they're at war in New South Wales.
Oh.
They're very, very close of becoming what the coalition has become in WA. Like Wes Fang, the Nat MP in the upper house, he's just at the.
He's feral.
He's feral. He's
feral.
off the chain. He's off the chain.
I know.
He's coming on the podcast next week, so I'll just.
I always used to say to people, it's lovely. I sit down next to a Nat and I get this is when you're crossing, you're having votes in the House or something. You find yourself sitting down next to a Nat, and you find out every bit of dirt on the Libs. They hate them. Yeah.
It's a funny arrangement too. It's this strange rump of agrarian socialists and sort of socially.
And there still are in New South Wales, and Victoria. Where
those two areas. I mean, they've become the one entity in Queensland. In Queensland, don't really exist in South Australia. Totally different parties, essentially, sit on the same side in WA.
Yeah.
Well, look, Meredith. Thank you so much for taking the time to come into the Weeds and tell your story. It's an incredible story of Australian history, Australian politics, of transformation, and really of hope. Because so many times as a policy maker and as a human being, you look at the problems we have and think we'll never solve this. But good people persevering, working together, can get things done. So you're an absolute treasure. No wonder you're AM now, aren't you? You've got a gong or two.
Yes.
You've got to. You had to think.
Sorry, I had to think. I've got to.
Yes. So look, thank you very much. You're an absolute treasure. It's been an honour and privilege to have the conversation with you.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's been really interesting. And I've been very impressed with your, homework.
We do our research. We do our research.
Oh, you know what research means, of course. Nowadays, research with the little fingers means, the dirt file.
Oh, yes. No, we didn't bring up all the nasty things. We'll chat about those when we're off air. But
Okay.
no, you've been an absolute. It's been it's been remarkable to talk to you. A real privilege, and thank you for taking the time for joining us.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's been fun.